Section 2 of the Writing of Fiction. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Writing of Fiction by Edith Wharton. Telling a Short Story. 1. Like the modern novel, the modern short story seems to have originated, or at least received its present stamp, in France. English writers, in this line, were slower in attaining the point to which the French and Russians first carried the art. Since then the short story has developed, and reached out in fresh directions, in the hands of such novelists as Mr. Hardy, only occasionally at his best in this form, of Stevenson, James, and Conrad, all three almost unfailingly excellent in it, of Mr. Kipling, past master of the Conti, and Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, whose delightful early volumes, Noughts and Crosses, and I Saw These Ships, are less known than they deserve to be. These writers had long been preceded by Scott in Wandering Willie's Tale and other short stories, by Poe, The Sporadic and Unaccountable, and by Hawthorne, but almost all the best tales of Scott, Hawthorne, and Poe belong to that peculiar category of the eerie which lies outside of the classic tradition. When the novel of manners comes to be dealt with, classification in order of time will have to be reversed, and in order of merit will be less easy, for even against Balzac, Tolstoy, and Turgenev, the genius of the great English observers, from Richardson and Jane Austen to Thackeray and Dickens, will weigh heavily in the balance. With regard to the short story, however, and especially to that compactest form of it, the short story, or conte, its first specimens are undoubtedly of continental production. But happily for English letters the generation who took over and adapted the formula were nursed to the Goethean principle that those who remain imprisoned in the false notion of their own originality will always fall short of what they might have accomplished. The sense of form, ready defined as the order, in time and importance, in which the narrated incidents are grouped, is, in all the arts, especially of the classic, the Latin tradition. 1,000 years of form, in the widest disciplinary sense, of its observance, its application, its tacit acceptance as the first condition of artistic expression, have cleared the grounds, for the French writer of fiction, of many superfluous encumbrances, as the soil of France is of all soils the most weeded, tilled, and ductile, so the field of art, wherever French culture extends, is the most worked over and the most prepared for whatever seed is to be sown in it. But when the great Russians, who owe to French culture much more than is generally conceded, took over that neat thing, the French nouvelle, they gave it the additional dimension it most often lacked. In any really good subject one has only to probe deep enough to come to tears, and the Russians almost always dig to that depth. The result has been to give to the short story, as French and Russian art have combined to shape it, great closeness of texture with profundity of form. Instead of a loose web spread over the surface of life they have made it, at its best, a shaft driven straight into the heart of human experience. 2. Though the critic no longer feels that need of classifying and subclassifying the genres which so preoccupied the contemporaries of Wordsworth, there are, in all the arts, certain local products that seem to necessitate a parenthesis. Such, in fiction, is the use of the supernatural. It seems to have come from mysterious Germanic and Armorican forests, from lands of long twilights and wailing winds, and it certainly did not pass through French or even Russian hands to reach us. Sorcerers and magic are of the south, the Mediterranean. The witch of Theocritus brewed a brew fit for her sister hags of the Scottish heath, but the spectral apparition walks only in the pages of English and Germanic fiction. It has done so, to great effect, in some of the most original of our great English short stories, from Scott's Wandering Willie and Poe's awful hallucinations to Le Fanu's Watcher, and from the Thrawn Janet of Stevenson to the Turn of the Screw of Henry James, last great master of the eerie in English. All these tales, in which the effect sought is completely archived, are models of the subtlest artifice. It is not enough to believe in ghosts, or even to have seen one, to be able to write a good ghost story. The greater the improbability to be overcome, the more studied must be the approach, the more perfectly maintained the air of naturalness, the easy assumption that things are always likely to happen in that way. One of the chief obligations, in a short story, is to give the reader an immediate sense of security. Every phrase should be a signpost, and never, unless intentionally, a misleading one. The reader must feel that he can trust to their guidance. His confidence once gained, he may be lured on to the most incredible adventures, as the Arabian Nights are there to show. A wise critic once said, "You may ask your reader to believe anything you can make him believe. It is never the genii who are unreal, but only their unconvinced historian's description of them. The least touch of irrelevance, the least chill of inattention, will instantly undo the spell, and it will take as long to weave again as to get Humpty Dumpty back on his wall. The moment the reader loses faith in the author's sureness of foot, the chasm of improbability gapes. Improbability in itself, then, is never a danger, but the appearance of improbability is, unless, indeed, the tale be based on what, in my first chapter, I called pathological conditions of body or mind outside the field of normal experience. But this term, of course, does not apply to states of mind inherited from an earlier phase of race culture, such as the belief in ghosts. No one with a spark of imagination ever objected to a good ghost story as improbable, though Mrs. Barbauld, who doubtless lacked the spark, is said to have condemned The Ancient Mariner on this ground. Most of us retain the more or less shadowy memory of ancestral terrors, and airy tongues that syllable men's names. We cannot believe a priori in the probability of the actions of madmen or neurasthenics, because their reasoning processes escape most of us, or can at best be imagined only as belonging to abnormal and exceptional people. But everybody knows a good ghost when he reads about him. When the reader's confidence is gained, the next rule of the game is to avoid distracting and splintering up his attention. Many a would-be tale of horror becomes innocuous through the very multiplication and variety of its horrors. Above all, if they are multiplied, they should be cumulative and not dispersed, but the fewer the better. Once the preliminary horror posited, it is the harping on the same string, the same nerve, that does the trick. Quiet iteration is far more racking than diversified assaults. The expected is more frightful than the unforeseen. The play of Emperor Jones is a striking instance of the power of simplification and repetition to excite in an audience a corresponding state of tension. By sheer voodoo practice it shows how voodoo acts. In The Turn of the Screw, which stands alone among tales of the supernatural in maintaining the ghostliness of its ghosts not only through a dozen pages but through close to 200, the economy of horror is carried to its last degree. What is the reader made to expect? Always, all through the book, that somewhere, in that hushed house of doom, the poor little governess will come on one of the two figures of evil with whom she is fighting for the souls of her charges. It will be either Peter Quint, or the horror of horrors, Miss Jessel. No diversion from this one dread is ever attempted or expected. It is true that the tale is strongly held together by its profound, its appalling, moral significance, but most readers will admit that, long before they are conscious of this, fear, simple, shivering animal fear, has them by the throat, which, after all, is what writers of ghost stories are after. 3. It is sometimes said that a good subject for a short story should always be capable of being expanded into a novel. The principle may be defendable in special cases, but it is certainly a misleading one on which to build any general theory. Every subject, in the novelist's sense of the term, must necessarily contain within itself its own dimensions, and one of the fiction writer's essential gifts is that of discerning whether the subject which presents itself to him, asking for incarnation, is suited to the proportions of a short story or of a novel. If it appears to be adapted to both, the chances are that it is inadequate to either. It would be as great a mistake, however, to try to base a hard and fast theory on the denial of the rule as on its assertion. Instances of short stories made out of subjects that could have been expanded into a novel, and that are yet typical short stories, and not mere stunted novels, will occur to every one. General rules in art are useful chiefly as a lamp in a mine, or a handrail down a black stairway. They are necessary for the sake of the guidance they give, but it is a mistake, once they are formulated, to be too much in awe of them. There are at least two reasons why a subject should find expression in novel form rather than as a tale, but neither is based on the number of what may be conveniently called incidents or external happenings, which the narrative contains. There are novels of action which might be condensed into short stories without the loss of their distinguishing qualities. The marks of the subject requiring a long development are, first, the gradual unfolding of the inner life of its characters, and secondly the need of producing in the reader's mind the sense of the lapse of time. Outward events of the most varied and exciting nature may without loss of probability be crowded into a few hours, but moral dramas usually have their roots deep in the soul, their rise far back in time, and the suddenest seeming clash in which they culminate should be led up to, step by step, as if to explain and justify itself. There are cases, indeed, when the short story may make use of the moral drama as its culmination, if the incident dealt with be one which a single retrospective flash sufficiently lights up to disqualify for use as a short story. But if the subject be so complex, and its successive phases so interesting, as to justify elaboration, the lapse of time must necessarily be suggested, and the novel form becomes appropriate. The effect of compactness and instantaneity sought in the short story is attained mainly by the observance of two unities, the old traditional one of time, and that other, more modern and complex, which requires that any rapidly enacted episode shall be seen through only one pair of eyes. It is fairly obvious that nothing is more retarding than the marking of a time interval long enough to suggest modification in the personages of the tale or in their circumstances. The use of such an interval inevitably turns a short story into a long tale unduly compressed, the bold scenario of a novel. In the third chapter, where an attempt will be made to examine the technique of the novel, it will be needful to explore that central mystery, of which Tolstoy was perhaps the most complete master, the art of creating in the reader's mind this sense of passing time. Meanwhile, it may be pointed out that a third, an intermediate form of tale, the long short story, is available for any subject too spreading for conciseness, yet too slight in texture to be stretched into a novel. The other unity, that of vision, will also be dealt with in considering the novel, in respect of which it becomes a matter much more complicated. Henry James, almost the only novelist who has formulated his ideas about his art, was the first to lay down the principle, though it had long, if intermittently, been observed by the masters of fiction. It may have occurred to other novelists, presumably it has, to ask themselves, as they sat down to write, who saw this thing I am going to tell about? By whom do I mean that it shall be reported? It seems as though such a question must precede any study of the subject chosen, since the subject is conditioned by the answer, but no critic appears to have propounded it, and it was left to Henry James to do so in one of those entangled prefaces to the definitive edition from which the technical axioms ought some day to be piously detached. It is clear that exactly the same thing never happens to any two people, and that each witness of a given instant will report it differently. Should some celestial taskmaster set the same theme to Jane Austen and George Meredith, the bewildered reader would probably have some difficulty in discovering the common denominator. Henry James, in pointing this out, also made the corollary suggestion that the mind chosen by the author to mirror his given case should be so situated and so constituted as to take the widest possible view of it. One thing more is needful for the ultimate effect of probability, and that is, never to let the character who serves as reflector record anything not naturally within his register. It should be the storyteller's first care to choose this reflecting mind deliberately, as one would choose a building site, or decide upon the orientation of one's house, and when this is done, to live inside the mind chosen, trying to feel, see, and react exactly as the latter would, no more, no less, and, above all, no otherwise. Only thus can the writer avoid attributing incongruities of thought and metaphor to his chosen interpreter. 4. It remains to try and see what constitutes, in any permanent sense, the underlying norm of the good short story. A curious distinction between the successful tale and the successful novel at once presents itself. It is safe to say, since the surest way of measuring achievement in art is by survival, that the test of the novel is that its people should be alive. No subject in itself, however fruitful, appears to be able to keep a novel alive, only the characters in it can. Of the short story the same cannot be said. Some of the greatest short stories owe their vitality entirely to the dramatic rendering of a situation. Undoubtedly the characters engaged must be a little more than puppets, but apparently, also, they may be a little less than individual human beings. In this respect the short story, rather than the novel, might be called the direct descendant of the old epic or ballad, of those earlier forms of fiction in all of which action was the chief affair, and the characters, if they did not remain mere puppets, seldom or never became more than types, such as the people, for instance, in Molière. The reason of the difference is obvious. Type, general character, may be set forth in a few strokes, but the progression, the unfolding of personality, of which the reader instinctively feels the need, if the actors in the tale are to retain their individuality for him through a succession of changing circumstances. This slow but continuous growth requires space, and therefore belongs by definition to a larger, a symphonic plan. The chief technical difference between the short story and the novel may therefore be summed up by saying that situation is the main concern of the short story, character of the novel, and it follows that the effect produced by the short story depends almost entirely on its form or presentation, even more, yes, and much more, than in the construction of the novel. The impression of vividness, of presentness, in the affair narrated has to be sought, and made sure of beforehand, by that careful artifice which is the real carelessness of art. The short story writer must not only know from what angle to present his anecdote, if it is to give out all its fires, but must understand just why that particular angle, and no other, is the right one. He must therefore have turned his subject over and over, walked around it, so to speak, and applied to it those laws of perspective, which Paolo Uccello called so beautiful, before it can be offered to the reader as a natural embellished fragment of experience, detached like a ripe fruit from the tree. The moment the writer begins to grope in the tangle of his material, to hesitate between one and another of the points that any actual happening thrusts up in such disorderly abundance, the reader feels a corresponding hesitancy, and the illusion of reality vanishes. The non-observance of the optics of the printed page results in the same failure to make the subject carry as the non-observance of the optics of the stage in presenting a play. By all means let the writer of short stories reduce the technical trick to its minimum, as the cleverest actresses put on the least paint, but let him always bear in mind that the surviving minimum is the only bridge between the reader's imagination and his. 5. Nietzsche said that it took genius to make an end, that is, to give the touch of inevitableness to the conclusion of any work of art. In the art of fiction this is peculiarly true of the novel, that slowly built-up monument, in which every stone has its particular weight and thrust to carry, and of which the foundations must be laid with a view to the proportions of the highest tower. Of the short story, on the contrary, it might be said that the writer's first care should be to know how to make a beginning. That an adequate or unreal ending diminishes the short tale in value as much as the novel need hardly be added, since it is proved with depressing regularity by the machine-made magazine story, to which one or the other of half a dozen standardized endings is automatically adjusted at the 4,500th word of whatsoever has been narrated. Obviously, as every subject contains its own dimensions, so is its conclusion ab ovo, and the failure to end a tale in accordance with its own deepest sense must deprive it of meaning. None the less, the short story writer's first concern, once he has mastered his subject, is to study what musicians call the attack. The rule that the first page of a novel ought to contain the germ of the whole is even more applicable to the short story, because in the latter case the trajectory is so short that flash and sound nearly coincide. Benvenuto Cellini relates in his autobiography that one day, as a child, while he sat by the hearth with his father, they both saw a salamander in the fire. Even then the sight must have been unusual, for the father instantly boxed his son's ears so that he should never forget what he had seen. This anecdote might serve as an apothegm for the writer of short stories. If his first stroke be vivid and telling, the reader's attention will be instantly won. "The hell," said the Duchess, as she lit her cigar, with which an Eton boy is said to have begun a tale for his school magazine, in days when duchesses less commonly smoked and swore, would undoubtedly have carried his narrative to posterity if what followed had been at the same level. This leads to another point. It is useless to box your reader's ear unless you have a salamander to show him. If the heart of your little blaze is not animated by a living, moving something, no shouting and shaking will fix the anecdote in your reader's memory. The salamander stands for that fundamental significance that made the story worth telling. The arrest of attention by a vivid opening should be something more than a trick. It should mean that the narrator has so brooded on this subject that it has become his, indeed, so made over and synthesized within him that, as a great draughtsman gives the essentials of a face or landscape in half a dozen strokes, the narrator can "situate" his tale in an opening passage which shall be a clue to all the detail eliminated. The clue given, the writer has only to follow, but his grasp must be firm. He must never for an instant forget what he wants to tell, or why it seemed worth telling. And this intensity of hold on his subject presupposes, before the telling of even a short story, a good deal of thinking over. Just because the limits of the form selected prevent his producing the semblance of reality by elaborating his characters, is the short story writer the more bound to make real the adventure in itself. A well-known French confectioner in New York was once asked why his chocolate, good as it was not equal to that made in Paris. He replied, "Because on account of the expense, we cannot work it over as many times as the French confectioner can." Other homely analogies confirm the lesson. The seemingly simplest sources are those that have been more cunningly combined and then most completely blent. The simplest looking dresses, those that require most study to design. The precious instinct of selection is distilled by that long patience which, if it be not genius, must be one of the genius's chief reliances in communicating itself. On this point repetition and insistence are excusable. The shorter the story, the more stripped of detail and cleared for action, the more it depends, for its effect, not only on the choice of what is kept when the superfluous has been jettisoned, but on the order in which these essentials are set forth. 6. Nothing but deep familiarity with his subject will protect the short story writer from another danger, that of contenting himself with a mere sketch of the episode selected. The temptation to do so is all the greater because some critics, in their resentment of the dense and the prolix, have tended to overestimate the tenuous and the tight. Merimie's tales are often cited as models of the Conte, but they are rather the breathless summaries of longer tales than the bold foreshortening of an episode from which all the significance it has to give has been adroitly extracted. It is easy to be brief and sharply outlined if one does away with one or more dimensions. The real achievement, as certain tales of Flaubert's and Turgenev's, of Stevenson's, and of Maupassant's show, is to suggest illimitable air within a narrow space. The stories of the German romantic Heinrich von Kleist have likewise been praised for an extreme economy of material, but they should rather be held up as an awful warning against waste, for in their ingenious dovetailing of improbable incidents, the only economy practised is that of leaving out all that would have enriched the subject, visually or emotionally. One, indeed, the Marquise d'O, thrift is carried so far that the characters are known merely by their initials, has in it the making of a good novel, not unlike Goethe's elective affinities, but reduced to the limits of a short story, it offers a mere skeleton of its subject. The phrase "economy of material" suggests another danger to which the novelist and the writer of short stories are equally exposed. Such economy is, in both cases, nearly always to be advised in the multiplication of accidental happenings, minor episodes, surprises, and contrarieties. Most beginners crowd into their work twice as much material of this sort as it needs. The reluctance to look deeply enough into a subject leads to the indolent habit of decorating its surface. I was once asked to read a manuscript on the eternal theme of a lovers' quarrel. The quarrelling pair made up, and the reasons for dispute and reconciliation were clearly inherent in their characters and situation, but the author, being new at the trade, felt obliged to cast about for an additional, a fortuitous, pretext for their reunion. So he sent them for a drive, made the horses run away, and caused the young man to save the young lady's life. This is a crude example of a frequent fault. Again and again the novelist passes by the real meaning of a situation, simply for lack of letting it reveal all its potentialities, instead of dashing this way and that in quest of fresh effects. If, when once drawn to a subject, he would let it grow slowly in his mind instead of hunting about for arbitrary combinations of circumstance, his tale would have the warm scent and flavour of a fruit ripened in the sun, instead of this insipidity of one forced in a hothouse. There is a sense in which the writing of fiction may be compared to the administering of a fortune. Economy and expenditure must each bear a part in it, but they should never degenerate into parsimony or waste. True economy consists in the drawing out of one subject of every drop of significance it can give; true expenditure in devoting time, meditation, and patient labor to the process of extraction and representation. It all comes back to a question of expense of time, of patience, of study, of thought, of letting hundreds of stray experiences accumulate and group themselves in the memory, till suddenly one of the number emerges and throws its sharp light on the subject which solicits you. It has been often and inaccurately said that the mind of a creative artist is a mirror, and the work of art the reflection of life in it. The mirror, indeed, is the artist's mind, with all his experiences reflected in it, but the work of art, from the smallest to the greatest, should be something projected, not reflected, something on which his mirrored experiences, at the right conjunction of the stars, are to be turned for its full illumination. Section 2, read by Inkel.